Hey guys, Gloria here. So I wanted to share something incredibly encouraging and convicting all at the same time for you guys. So I've been reading Deuteronomy and God gave me a completely different perspective than I've ever had before on this story. So in Deuteronomy 1, in verse 6, God commands Moses and the Israelites to go and advance into the hill of the country of the Amorites. So in case you don't know what the Amorites are, the Amorites are Israel's greatest enemies in this time point. They're God's greatest enemies as well. And God is telling them to go and to advance into their country. In verse 8, God says to them, I have given you this land. Go in and possess it. God then later commands them and says, hey, I know that these enemies are great, but go and do not be afraid of anyone. Do not be discouraged. At the time, I have told you everything you were to do. See, God already made it clear what they were to do despite what they could do. God asked them to do what seemed unrealistic, what seemed illogical, to go into the country of the Amorites and possess their land. See, something wasn't adding up here. And the Israelites began panicking and began to feel fear and began to feel discouraged and began to wonder and question, did we hear God right? And so instead of obeying God and just doing exactly what he said, despite the commands, despite the encouragement of the fact that God said, hey, I'll be with you. I've gone into the land before you. This is for you. Go for it. They began to question, and they come up with an idea. And they say, what if we send 12 spies ahead of us to go and ensure that this land is good for us? So they tell Moses, hey, that we think this is the best idea. And Moses says to them, yeah, I agree. The idea seemed good, is what he says in scripture. So they send the 12 spies to go into the land to make sure, to just ensure that the Amorites are not there, to ensure that God is being honest and to ensure that God went before them to take care of the Amorites. So they return with good news, but not just good news. They return with proof. They return with fruit from the land. And they say this in verse 25, yeah, it's good land and it's from the Lord. Duh, it's good. God already said it's good. God already said to go ahead and possess the land. Why did they have to send spies? And I'm realizing it's because of unbelief. I wonder how many times God speaks his promises over us and over our lives and over our circumstances, unbelievable promises of his goodness and his mercy and his grace, yet we don't believe him. See, we rather go and send spies for proof of the promise. We rather consult with our friends to make sure that we heard God right. We rather receive approval from our peers when we've already gotten approval from God. So we begin yapping around to others when the omniscient has already spoken. Why is that? It's because we don't believe in the goodness of God, so we begin to test the waters. We begin to test who God is, and in return, we act out in disobedience and rebellion. And it's crazy, because if you think about it, we begin to act like unbelievers, because God already gave them the game plan. It's not up to us to figure out the how, when, where, and why when we know the who. But see, the Israelites didn't trust the who, so they sent spies to get proof. Don't be the person who forfeits the promise of God because you needed to obtain visual proof. Know that God is truthfully good. In verse 26, we see how the unthinkable happens. It says this, you were unwilling to go up. You rebelled against the command of the Lord. It goes on to talk about how the Israelites grumbled in their tents and dared to say, God hates us. He brought us into Egypt to deliver us into the hands of the Amorites, to destroy us. See, the They began thinking that God was being deceitful and trying to trick them and deliver them into the hands of the Amorites instead of to actually give them a good gift. See, they didn't believe God was good. They didn't believe God was who he says he is, a deliverer. Instead, they believed God was deceitful and trying to trick them. See, if we don't believe what God says, we are only bound to believe what the enemy says. And that's how Satan uses unbelief. He uses unbelief to trick our minds into questioning the unwavering character and nature of God. He did it with Eve in the garden. Why would he not do it with you too? See, the enemy can't come up with new strategies. He continually gravitates toward the strategy of deceit because he knows that he can win time and time again when we believe lies like Adam and Eve. See, if we can question the nature and character of God, we will not trust God, and we surely will not obey him. And at the end of the day, a battle that is supposed to end in victory on our hands seems to feel like victory in the enemy's hands. See, because the Israelites ended up forfeiting the promise of God in exchange for proof. What if God just wants us to believe and take a step on faith without proof at all other than his word? What if his word was enough proof for obedience for us? See, I'm starting to realize that obedience is synonymous to faith. You obey what you have faith in. You disobey when you don't have faith at all. And that was the case for the Israelites. They truly did not have faith. Therefore, they could not trust God. Therefore, they could not obey God. What if today we decided that we would put an end to unbelief in our lives and we would trust God despite the circumstance and despite the situation? That we would decide that once the omniscient has spoken a promise, we will cling to that promise and not have to tweet to gain acceptance when we've already been given approval, not have to go to our friends to get a cosign when God has already spoken. What if we believed that God was right at all times, despite the circumstance, despite the situation, and we began to live like God is honest? See, all of his promises, it says in scripture, are yes and amen. It's only us and our unbelief that forfeit the promise of God in our lives. So I pray this week that you choose to no longer forfeit God's promises because of the present. Don't forfeit God's promise because of what you see. Don't forfeit God's promise because of what you don't see. Don't forfeit God's promise in exchange for proof. Go into the promises that he has for you, even when you don't know the how. You know that you can bank on the who, because the who is honest in nature. He is unwavering in character, and when he speaks, his words are definitive and final, and not once has God lied in scripture. Now is not the time that his character would change. Scripture says that he is the same yesterday, today, and forevermore, and because of that, he is trustworthy. He is the basket in which I can put all of my eggs in and know that I will not doubt it. Yes, I might go through the wilderness, just like the Israelites, but when God speaks his promise, I'm not going to doubt his voice. No, I'm going to make a decision that I'm going to know God's voice and believe God's voice, even if it is not what I want to hear. I am going to trust and obey, because scripture says there is no other way. We know the hymn, trust and obey, for there is no other way to be happy with Jesus. What if we didn't just sing those words, but we believed those words? And what if we began to walk in the promises of God with no fear, with no discouragement, because we know who goes behind us, before us, with us, and is next to us? So be encouraged today. Go into the promises God has for you, even if it seems unrealistic and illogical. Know that God will create miracles and bust down doors to ensure that his promise comes to pass, for he is not a liar. So be encouraged today.